The story begins with a ship making its way toward its destination through the dangerous and desolate routes of the South Atlantic Ocean. On this very ship, there is a weather officer named David. The government had sent him to this unknown island so that he could record the island's strange and constantly changing weather. He was to stay there for a whole year, collect data, uncover the secrets of the weather, and then return. After a long and exhausting journey, the ship finally approaches the island. Using a small boat, the captain and David cut through the choppy waves to reach the shore, bringing with them a year's worth of rations and essential supplies. In front of them stands an old lighthouse, and next to it a small house where a weather officer used to live. Now, David was to be stationed there in his place. The previous officer, Robert, had completed his duty and was supposed to return today with Captain Axel's ship. But as soon as they enter the house, the atmosphere suddenly changes. As soon as they step into the rooms, both of them stop in their tracks. There is no sign of anyone having lived there. The furniture is scattered, chairs are overturned, belongings are strewn about, as if not a storm but some terrifying chaos had erupted here. Robert is nowhere to be seen. The silence was so profound that even the sound of their own breathing felt heavy. Their suspicion immediately turns to the lighthouse. Without wasting any time, the captain and David head there, but the scene that greets them is even more disturbing. The entire lighthouse is surrounded on all sides by sharp, pointed wooden stakes, as if someone has deliberately barricaded it like a fortress so that no one can get inside. They knock on the gate several times, call out, but there is no response from within. Finally, the captain forcefully pushes the gate and somehow it opens. As soon as they enter, they find a man on the upper floor. His name was Gruner. He was lying on the ground, a strange coldness in his eyes and an expression of indifference on his face. When he is asked about the former weather officer, he replies in an extremely soft tone, "He is dead." Upon hearing this, the atmosphere becomes even heavier. When the captain asks about the dead body, Gruner gives an even stranger answer, "Maybe someone killed him." Hearing his words, David and the captain look at each other. For the first time, they realize that this island is not just deserted. Something very wrong is hidden here. As the captain was leaving, he told David that if he changed his mind, he could still return with the ship. But David knew that if he managed to deliver the correct and complete weather data from this island to the authorities, he would earn a good amount of money, and he truly needed the money. That's why he decided to stay. As a precaution, the captain handed him a gun, and as he was leaving, simply said that this place isn't as straightforward as it looks from the outside. As soon as the ship left, a strange silence settled all around. David fixed up the house a bit, arranged his belongings, and began preparing himself to live here. Just then, he found an old diary in a drawer. It belonged to the same weather officer who had been stationed here before him. On the first page of the diary, it was written that he had set foot on this island in 1913. The following pages contained notes about the weather, the sea, and the nights here, but in many places, the entries were left incomplete. Between some of the lines, there were strange sketches of creatures David had never seen before. He couldn't understand why anyone would draw such frightening images. On one page, there was also a photograph of the officer's wife, which looked even more out of place in this desolate place. He didn't even realize when he fell asleep while reading the diary. The next morning, he started his work, but as soon as he reached the seashore, his steps stopped on their own. Among the rocks, some stones had been arranged in such a way that they formed a strange pattern, and in between them, seashells from the ocean had been placed, as if someone had deliberately made these markings. David convinced himself that this must have been Gruner's doing, and then he got back to his work. While collecting data, when he looked toward the lighthouse through his binoculars, he saw the shadow of another person along with Gruner. He was startled for a moment, but then reassured himself that it was just his imagination. Night had deepened, and David was inside the house writing his notes when suddenly there was a knock at the door. He thought it must be Gruner. He called out, but there was no response from outside. As he picked up the lamp and moved toward the door, a strange rustling sound began to echo in his ears. At that very moment, he saw a strange hand trying to reach inside from under the door. That hand was not human. Its fingers were unnaturally long, and its movements were extremely terrifying. David's breathing quickened. His heart felt like it would burst out of his chest. Without wasting a moment, he ran toward the basement and hid there. Within moments, that mysterious creature had entered the house. The sound of its slow, rough footsteps echoed through the house, as if it was searching for something in the darkness. Peeking through a small crack in the basement, David saw two glowing, terrifying eyes staring right back at him through the same crack. With trembling hands, David picked up the knife. As soon as his eyes fell on the crack in the wall, without thinking, he thrust the blade inside with all his strength. The very next moment, a scream rang out so piercing that his ears went numb. The creature, writhing in pain, retreated and disappeared somewhere into the darkness. But David knew this wasn't the end. She could come back at any time. He slammed the basement gate shut, tied it tightly several times with a thick rope, and spent the entire night sitting right in front of that door. His eyes kept fluttering, his heart pounded rapidly, and every slight sound reminded him of that scream again. He spent that night in nothing but fear. In the morning, when he stepped outside and saw the marks in the sand, a chill ran through his body. These footprints were nothing like those of a human. The toes were much longer, the claws deeper, and the gait resembled that of some wild creature. The tracks led straight toward the sea and ended right there. In that moment, everything became clear to him. Now he understood why Gruner had placed sharp wooden stakes all around the lighthouse. It was all to keep that thing away. His heart sank. This house was not safe for him, not even for a moment. Terrified, he ran toward the lighthouse, out of breath, his throat parched. As soon as he reached the gate, he shouted, "Open the gate! Let me in!" But a cold voice came from inside. "You should have left with that ship." And the gate was not opened. David stood there for a few seconds, then turned back with heavy steps. Now he had to protect himself. He boarded up every window of the house with wooden planks, drove sharp stakes into the ground all around, and gathered old papers, books, and broken things outside the gate to make a pile. He poured oil over it so that if that thing came again, he could scare it away with fire. Everything was ready, but there was one thing David didn't know, and tonight, he was definitely going to find out. By chance, David found an old box inside the house. As soon as he lifted the lid, his eyes widened. Inside was a gun, along with a pile of bullets. For the first time, a faint glimmer of hope sparked in his heart. He was still afraid, but now he had a way to fight back. As soon as the sun set, darkness began to creep in from all sides. David sat in a corner of the house, clutching the gun. His breathing was fast, and his ears were alert to every sound. Suddenly, a strange rustling came from outside. He was just about to move toward the window when the ground seemed to slip from under his feet. Not one, but several of those terrifying creatures were emerging from the water. Their dark shadows rose from the waves and headed straight for his house. In moments, they attacked the gate. The wood began to creak and splinter. Without thinking, David started firing. Some creatures fell right there, but the rest became even more aggressive. Now they were trying to break in. He didn't waste any time. He set fire to the pile of papers and old books outside the gate. Flames shot up, and as soon as the creatures saw the fire, they began to retreat and ran back toward the sea. But now that same fire was starting to consume his house. The wooden house caught ablaze in an instant. David wrapped himself in a sheet, broke through the gate, and somehow managed to escape, hiding behind a large rock near the lighthouse. His right hand was badly burned. Tears welled up in his eyes from the pain. Just then, as if the heavens took pity on him, rain began to pour from the sky. The fire slowly died down, but by morning, his house had turned to ashes. Now he had no way out. If he wanted to survive, the lighthouse was his last refuge. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse. After a while, Gruner came out to fetch water. David quietly followed him, his intentions clear, to force his way inside at gunpoint. But then something happened that he hadn't expected. A strange creature standing next to Gruner suddenly lunged at him. It was his protector. Gruner raised his hand to stop David and said, "It's my pet." David didn't shoot, but he made his condition clear. If he wanted to stay alive, he had to be allowed to live in the lighthouse. He had enough gunpowder to last a year, and enough food for both of them to survive. Gruner was silent for a moment, then slowly nodded. Before evening, the two of them gathered the remaining food and returned to the lighthouse. The next morning, David woke up to a strange sensation. That same creature was quietly licking his burned hand. In just a short while, the pain began to subside, and the burning faded away. It was nothing short of a miracle. At the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner counting bullets, while the creature was helping him in its own way. It was now clear that this animal wasn't as violent as it seemed. David wanted to learn more about it. He wanted to reveal this truth to the world because it was nothing less than a miracle, a strange female creature from the depths of the sea. If the truth came out, both David and Gruner could become famous worldwide. But Gruner didn't want any of that. He didn't want to leave the island. He had no one of his own. He believed that in society, every person lives as someone's slave, so this island was perfect for him. This was his world, where he saw himself as king, master of his own will. That's why he had written in many places, "Only Gruner is king." But how did that female creature become his pet? Once, she accidentally got caught in his fishing net. She was very young then. Gruner saved her life. From that day on, she started living with him. She obeyed his every command, but Gruner's anger always weighed heavily on her. He never treated her with humanity. He kept forcing himself on her. Once, the creature even attacked him, and in return, Gruner punished her so harshly that after that, she began to see herself as his servant. Perhaps that's why every night the same creatures would come out of the sea to take her back, but they couldn't attack in daylight. Now David had no intention of staying here. Only one thought kept running through his mind. Somehow signal an incoming ship and escape this cursed place. Gruner kept insisting that no ship ever came near this island, but David refused to believe him. With every breath, he felt suffocated here. It felt as if the island was slowly swallowing him whole. As evening fell, Gruner handed him a gun and said, "Get ready. There could be another attack tonight." Both of them began preparing to turn on the lighthouse light. In no time, the surface of the sea began to stir again. One after another, dozens of creatures emerged and started heading straight for the lighthouse. Gruner kept firing continuously, but David's hands began to tremble. His heart was pounding wildly. He retreated inside and crouched in a corner. Gruner kept shouting, but fear had gripped David. Soon, darkness fell before his eyes and he fainted. In the morning, Gruner shook him awake. There was anger in his eyes and command in his voice. "If you want to stay here, you'll have to obey my every word. You'll have to fetch water every day, do all the chores big and small in the lighthouse, and stand guard every night." Whether he wanted to or not, he had no other choice. To survive, he had to do all this. David was ready to do everything, but one thing broke him from inside: the way the female creature was treated, which made his heart sink every time he saw it. But he kept telling himself that a man who had lived alone on a deserted island for years might not be right in the head. Maybe Gruner had become just like that too. That night, both of them went out on guard duty again. The sea began to stir once more, and the same creatures started to emerge. This time, David didn't have that old fear inside him. He fired, and just then, Gruner suddenly shut the lighthouse gate. He went inside, leaving David alone outside. Now, this was his fight. David kept screaming, kept calling for help, but there was no response from inside. He fought those creatures all night long. Bullets kept flying, his hands kept trembling, blows landed on his body, but he didn't fall. When dawn broke and the sky lightened, Gruner opened the gate. David was sitting outside, covered in blood, breathing heavily. But there was no fear in his eyes anymore. Now he had learned. Now he knew how to fight these creatures. Time kept passing in the same way. The nights were spent fighting those creatures, and the days were spent handling the lighthouse chores for Gruner. This island was no longer an open place for David. It had started to feel like a closed room. One question kept circling in his mind every moment. When would the day come when he could finally leave this place? When would he be able to breathe freely again? Meanwhile, he had developed a strange sort of friendship with that female creature. Now he had started to feel bad for her. David had come to understand how hard it is to live alone, cut off from your own kind. Maybe she felt the same way. He had given her a name, Anarius. After a few days, they realized that the attacks were gradually decreasing. David thought that maybe, like whales, they went somewhere else during the winter. Or maybe they had come to understand that fighting these two would achieve nothing. But Gruner made it clear, that's not the case. They're not stopping, they're multiplying now. Their numbers are increasing. A few more days passed in this uneasiness. One night after dinner, the two of them started playing chess to pass the time. They got so engrossed in the game that they forgot to turn on the lighthouse light, and the creatures took advantage of the darkness to attack. This time, the situation was not like before. David saw that their numbers had increased many times over. They had bred. There were so many of them that even the two of them together couldn't hold out for long. They were almost out of bullets too. Somehow, fighting their way up, they reached the top of the lighthouse, but in the process, Gruner suffered a deep wound in his leg. The creatures were trying to break in from below. There were screams all around, sounds of banging, and the creaking of breaking wood. There seemed to be no way out. Both of them had accepted in their hearts that this might be their last night, and just then, dawn began to break. As soon as the first rays of the sun spread, the creatures started to retreat and disappeared one by one into the sea. Anarius kept trying to heal Gruner's wounds, but now David clearly understood that they could not win this fight. They were running out of bullets. There wasn't enough food left to last many more days. The next day, fate gave them another chance. David was walking outside the lighthouse when he spotted a ship in the sea. His heart started pounding. He ran inside to get the flare gun, but Gruna stopped him. Gruna didn't want David to leave. At that moment, Anaris attacked Gruna. She wanted to save David. Gruna didn't want anyone to leave the island. This was his world. Here, he considered himself the king. It was a life where no one questioned him, where a servant obeyed his every command. He didn't want to leave all this behind and go to the city, and he didn't want David to leave either. Before David's eyes, the ship slowly disappeared into the sea. A few more days passed in this silence and tension. Gruner's behavior became even harsher. He started treating David badly, but he was even more cruel to Anaris. Seeing this broke David's heart. One day, he gifted Anaris a small toy boat he had made from whale bones. Maybe it would lighten her heart a little, but as soon as Anaris saw the boat, she took him to a corner of the island. There was a real boat. When David asked Gruner about it, he replied coldly that he already knew about it. A few months ago, an armed smuggling ship had sunk near the island because of a storm. Some people had managed to reach the island alive in a boat, but before morning, none of them survived. All of them fell prey to the creatures. Hearing all this, a dangerous but hopeful plan formed in David's mind. There was an old diving suit in the lighthouse. If one of them wore the suit and went down to that part of the sea, it was possible they could find bullets or dynamite from the sunken ship, and if that happened, fighting those monsters would become much easier. As soon as Gruner heard this, he flatly refused. He didn't want to go near the sea, but David was ready, even if it meant risking his life. A few more days passed in this restlessness. During this time, a deep bond formed between David and Anaris. He began to understand her, to read her silence. Gruner quietly observed all this. For the first time, a new thought entered his mind. Maybe he should help David, but the story in his heart was something else. He wanted David to bring up the box of dynamite from under the sea with his help, and then leave him alone in the sea so the creatures would kill him. The dynamite would also be with him. Would go to him, and Anaris would once again become his complete slave. A few days later, the two of them reached that spot. David put on the heavy diving suit and descended into the sea. Everything below was in ruins. The ship had long been destroyed, but luck was on his side. He actually spotted some boxes of dynamite. Just then, the creatures appeared out of the dark water. David panicked. His foot slipped, and he fell. The iron suit was so heavy that he couldn't even move. He wanted to send a signal up, but didn't get the chance. Above, Gruner thought the creatures had killed him, but the reality was different. There were only 2 small children there. Underwater, David composed himself, took a deep breath, left the suit behind, and swam upwards. Somehow, he made it to the surface. From there, they managed to retrieve as many boxes of dynamite as they could, then laid them out in 2 layers around the lighthouse, so that the next time there was an attack, everything could be finished in one blow. Months passed, the cold increased, snow began to fall, and once again the creatures disappeared. The attacks had stopped. Now their days began to pass in the old routine again, running the lighthouse, keeping watch, and every night looking up at the sky, waiting for the next sign. Gruner's patience had completely run out. He was convinced that Anaris had told the monsters about the dynamite plan. That was why they weren't attacking anymore. As soon as he thought this, his anger exploded. He raised his hand against Anaris. David intervened and stopped him. After that confrontation, the two of them made a new plan. The main gate of the lighthouse would be left open, so that as soon as the creatures came in, they could be blown up in one go. As night deepened, the sea began to stir again. One by one, the creatures started emerging and heading straight for the main gate. As soon as they entered, they pounced on David. David showed courage and fought back. As they neared the lighthouse, Gruner pressed the dynamite lever. Nothing happened. There was no blast. David realized he had forgotten to reconnect the wires after opening the connection. Without wasting time, he ran upstairs and started fixing the wires. Down below, Gruner was alone, trying to hold off the creatures. Their numbers kept increasing and they began climbing the lighthouse. As soon as the connection was complete, David detonated the first layer. There was a massive explosion. Many creatures were killed on the spot, but plenty still remained. Seeing the situation worsen, Gruner detonated the second layer as well. In the echo of the blast, both of them lost consciousness. When they came to in the morning, Anaris was gone. Dead creatures lay everywhere. The ones still alive were badly wounded, and Gruner was finishing them off one by one. Just then, David noticed a necklace hanging around the neck of one of the creatures. In that moment, he realized his biggest mistake. The creatures he had always thought of as savage were actually civilized, just like humans. They couldn't speak, but they had their own people, their own relationships. Maybe there was a reason for their attacks on the lighthouse, but for Gruner, none of this mattered. For him, he was the king of this island, and everyone had to obey his orders. After that day, the creatures were never able to attack in the same way again, but every day, a crying voice could be heard from the seashore. Until then, David had no idea how much damage they had caused. How many families had been torn apart, how many children had lost their loved ones, all because of a misunderstanding. The next day, David saw some small creature children in the sea. All of them had lost their families. He made a circle of stones and placed the little toy boat in the middle, hoping Anaris would return. He waited for a long time, but Anaris never came back. One morning, David woke up to find Gruner lying unconscious on the ground. Some old belongings were scattered near him. Among them was an old photograph. As soon as David picked it up, his hands began to tremble. It was the same girl, the same face whose picture he had seen in Gruner's diary on the first day. Now the truth was out. She was none other than Gruner's wife. Gruner used to be the weather officer of this lighthouse. He had come here about a year ago with his wife. His real name was Robert, but he had changed it, because now he never wanted to leave this island. Maybe this was where his world had ended. Seeing all this, the last bit of hope inside David also broke. Now, he was convinced that he too might never be able to leave this island. The next evening, he went to the seashore. The little toy boat was no longer in the circle of stones, but in its place, he saw a small creature child. In its tiny hands was that same boat. David gently picked up his torch and threw it into the circle of stones. He wanted to show that he hadn't come to fight, that he didn't want to harm anyone, that now he wanted friendship, not war, with them. Soon after, the waves of the sea began to stir. Anaris was the first to emerge, and behind her the whole group of creatures surfaced from the water. But this time, the atmosphere was different. No one attacked David. There was no anger in their eyes, only exhaustion. They hadn't come to fight. They were just looking for a safe place for their children. Exactly what every living being does. The sudden presence of humans on this island was unacceptable to them, which is why they attacked night after night. But who could explain this to Gruner? For him, he was still the king of this island. Gruner came out of the lighthouse, gun in hand. David stepped forward and tried to explain to him that these creatures didn't want to fight. They wanted peace. But Gruner was in no mood to listen to anyone. He shouted at Anaris to go inside. This time, for the first time, Anaris didn't obey. She was no longer his servant. Now she was just a mother, standing up for her children. Something inside Gruner began to break. He realized that no one was following his orders anymore. In anger, he headed toward the lighthouse. David thought that maybe now he had understood that everyone wants freedom. No one wants to live as someone else's slave. But Gruner was no longer a rational man. As soon as he reached the lighthouse, he picked up the signal gun and fired a flare. It went straight and hit a small creature child. The child died instantly. Chaos erupted all around. The creatures started running away in fear, and at that moment, the last bit of trust in David's eyes broke for Anaris as well. David's blood boiled. He ran toward the lighthouse and confronted Gruner. "Why did you do all this?" These people only wanted peace. But Gruner had become so violent that he decided to kill David right then and there. With an axe in hand, just as Gruner was about to strike David, David called him by his real name, Robert. The moment that name reached his ears, he stopped immediately. In reality, Robert was never the kind of person he had become. After coming to this island, his mind had gradually started to break down. Loneliness, the death of his wife, and deep depression, all of these had changed him from within. He wasn't a killer. He was once a good man, and even the creatures never wanted to fight. They only wanted peace. Gruner had killed them just so he could feel powerful. Now, he began to realize his biggest mistake. He quietly put down his weapon and surrendered himself to the creatures. Within moments, they killed him. David went inside the lighthouse and locked himself in from the inside. Days turned into months, and time kept passing like this. A year later, a government officer arrived on the island. With him was a new weather officer. David was taken away from there, and weather monitoring on the island resumed. But the new officer thought that David was Gruner. David did not correct their misunderstanding. He quietly went and stood on the lighthouse balcony without saying a word, because now he too did not want to leave the island, just like Gruner. Meanwhile, Anarus was happy with her family. Now they no longer had to fear someone like Gruner. Now they could live freely both on the island and in the sea.